Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. As I think everybody on this webinar knows, last Friday, Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump met in Alaska to discuss the war in Ukraine, among other issues. This was the first time that the two leaders have had a face-to-face meeting since Trump's return to the White House. And stakes were certainly high for US foreign policy, for NATO, and of course for the future of Ukraine. This was followed very quickly on Monday when European leaders joined Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in Washington for a meeting with Donald Trump. To help us parse what this all means for Ukraine, what it means for relations between the United States and Russia and the transatlantic community writ large, I'm pleased to welcome ACG Young Leader alumna, Dr. Angela Stent. She is Professor Emerita at Georgetown University and has been a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Starting next month, she will be a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Angela has served in the U.S. State Department's Office for Policy Planning and as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the U.S. National Intelligence Council, the NIC. She's the author of a book called Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. Angela, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be back on your show.
It is always great to see you, Angela, and you always have such terrific insights for us. And I'd maybe like to start with Monday and sort of the readout, the better part of the way into the week on what happened on Monday, and then maybe back up and talk a little bit about the bilateral meeting between Putin and Trump. And I guess sort of my opening question for our conversation today is whether the meeting in Washington between Trump and Zelensky, with all the European leaders in tow, was a turning point for Russia's war in Ukraine.
So unfortunately, it turns out that it really wasn't a turning point for Russia's war in Ukraine. But on Monday, when we had the 7 European leaders plus Volodymyr Zelensky meeting with President Trump, it did appear to be a successful meeting. The leaders all went there to back Zelensky up. No one wanted a recurrence of the disastrous meetings that Zelensky had in the Oval Office at the end of February, when he was chastised and in essence thrown out of the White House. And I think they also wanted to make sure, not knowing what President Trump and President Putin had negotiated or might negotiate in the future, they wanted to make the point that there can be no deal without security guarantees for Ukraine. In other words, there has to be a situation in place where Russia is deterred from invading Ukraine again, or going further and threatening other European countries. And so in that sense, first of all, the meeting in the Oval Office was successful. President Zelensky wore a suit this time, not his military fatigues. He was again chastised in February for not being properly dressed and showing enough respect. He brought along a letter from First Lady of Ukraine to the First Lady of the United States. Mrs. Trump had sent a letter to President Putin about children, rather vaguely worded, but we know that the Russians have abducted 20,000 Ukrainian children and forced them either into orphanages or to be adopted by Russians. So there was a letter from Mrs. Zelensky about, again, the importance of paying attention to children who've been suffering in this war. President Zelensky expressed his gratitude for everything that the U.S. had done. And so there were no harsh words. The body language was better. President Trump did spend quite a lot of time talking about other issues, mainly American domestic issues, which really have nothing to do with the Russia-Ukraine war, but I think people are used to that. And then what we saw, at least publicly, was the larger meeting with the European leaders. And at the end of that, they all came out saying that the United States agreed that there had to be security guarantees for Ukraine after the war, that some European countries are thinking of deploying some troops in the western part of Ukraine once the war's over, again, to enforce the peace, if you like, that the United States itself is not going to have any boots on the ground. I think all of your viewers have to know that the MAGA supporters of President Trump really are against giving any more support to Ukraine and certainly would not support sending American soldiers there. But at least on Monday and on Tuesday, it looked as if the U.S. did say that the U.S. would provide air support backup for the European force there, because I think Europeans understand that those kind of security assurances, they have to have US backing. And if they don't, then Russia is less likely to be deterred. So I would say that, and I would also say that during the meeting, the issue of a ceasefire was barely discussed. President Trump, and I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, had gone into the meeting with Putin saying that the aim was a ceasefire. And that's what European leaders had discussed with Zelensky the previous week when they all met in Europe. Then Zelensky, I guess, had a bilateral meeting also with Prime Minister Starmer. And they'd all said, you have to have a ceasefire before you can start talking about negotiating a peace agreement. President Trump had come out of the meeting with Putin saying, no, we don't need a ceasefire. We're going straight to negotiations to end the war. And it was Chancellor Merz who brought up, at least in what we saw, the public was able to see in that meeting, that he still thought that it was important to have a ceasefire, but that kind of issue then passed and it really wasn't mentioned again. And the other issue that was clearly raised there was President Trump saying that the U.S. was going to help organize very quickly a bilateral meeting between Presidents Putin and Zelensky, to be followed after that by a trilateral meeting at which President Trump would be present. Again, this of course excludes the Europeans, but this was also said at the end of those discussions. So I would say the European leaders left Washington, understanding that the U.S. had bought into the idea of security guarantees for Ukraine provided by Europe with a U.S. backstop, although the details were very vague. Again, the public wasn't really privy to them, and I suspect that there weren't that many details, because if you look at all the media in different European countries, there were a lot of discussions about what this would look like. But anyway, that's what they came out with. Of course, subsequently, barely 2 or 3 days later, the Russians made it clear that they would not accept. Putin had already said that Russia will not accept NATO troops on Ukrainian soil. Of course, these European troops would not be deployed under a NATO umbrella. They would be individual countries, Great Britain, maybe France, some other countries, so far not Germany, that would deploy some troops there. But Putin said that was unacceptable, and then Foreign Minister Lavrov came out and reiterated demands that were made in March and April of 2022, the first time that they tried to come to a peace agreement, saying that Russia and China have to be guarantors as well, and that Russia can have veto power over maybe choices that Ukraine or the Europeans might make looking forward. So the very idea that Russia, the aggressor in this war, with an unprovoked attack on Ukraine in February 22, that Russia should somehow be a guarantor of peace in the future, I would say is highly questionable.
Mm-hmm. Angela, thank you. You've put a lot on the table for us to sort of dissect a little bit and hone in on. You sort of anticipated that I wanted to ask you a little bit about the optics. I think obviously Zelensky's attire was one of the things that caught a lot of people's attention, that he, had learned his lessons from his first meeting in the White House. But what did you take away from all of these European leaders coming and trying to sort of show a united front, right? I mean, there was even discussion in the press about European leaders disrupting their summer vacations to come. Everybody was there basically within 24 hours. This really was an attempt to sort of show a united front by the European leaders and provide a little bit of a counterweight to maybe the uncertainty of how the US president might react or respond. Can you talk a little bit about sort of your takeaways from the compilation of European leaders that we saw?
So I think there are several messages there. One of them is that, when President Trump came in, he was still talking about possibly, or deriding NATO, saying that these countries were free riders, and that the US, that they had to take care of their own defense. He, in his first term, was certainly very critical of many European countries, particularly Germany, but not only Germany. And of course, we know that from the Kremlin's point of view, and this has been a Kremlin goal forever, where in the Soviet and post-Soviet times, of splitting the US and Europe, and most recently, since Trump came into office, Kremlin propagandists have to some extent praised him and really derided the Europeans and said, they really don't count for anything. So I think, and then in the lead up to this, obviously, we had a NATO summit a couple of months ago, and there was great concern about what might happen there. And the European leaders very carefully prepared it, particularly Secretary General Mark Rutte, who was, of course, at the White House meeting, so that it would be successful. And it was, because everyone pledged to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. We can talk about how they're going to measure that, how that's going to work out, but that's what President Trump wanted to hear. And so he had praiseworthy things to say about them. So there are a couple of articles in the American media today saying Europeans have learned how to talk to President Trump. They've learned the language they needed. So I think the show of unity was partly, again, to impress on President Trump that these European countries are united, that they want to support Ukraine, and that they're willing to work with the United States. But again, if you listened, each leader, and that again was public, had to make a short introduction about who they were. We then get, again, praising President Trump for meeting with President Putin, praising him for trying to get negotiations underway. I think it was Ursula von der Leyen who herself raised the issue of the abducted children, but it was mainly, these were positive statements that they made encouraging President Trump. So on the one hand, you can say, yes, they wanted to show unity, and yes, they were deferential to President Trump, because I think they've all learned, and particularly with what happened to Zelensky in February, that if you're not deferential to President Trump, and if you try and push back against some of the things he's saying, the consequences can be very negative. As an aside, obviously, the EU has now negotiated a tariff agreement with the United States. I'm sure those issues are not far from these leaders' minds either, but the need to keep this relationship with Trump as productive as possible. Now, again, in some of the media, the Western media, some of the European leaders will criticize. The Russians, of course, had a field day saying, they look like school children in a class with the teacher. And there were various, AI memes that made the rounds of social media deriding them. So, but you would expect that from the Russians, because they're now, their line now is that the Europeans don't count for anything. But I think those optics were important. And I think for Zelensky, for Ukraine, it was very important to have this show of support from these leading European countries, and including, obviously, the Secretary General of NATO, the President of the European Commission. Very important, morale, if not booster, people, the Ukrainians understanding that however difficult and unpredictable the future is in terms of negotiations, they do have the support from all the major European countries.
Yeah, related to this, though, somebody just submitted a question asking whether the fact that all of these European leaders came to Washington actually projects strength on their part or weakness. The viewer writes that the amount of praise that they felt that they needed to sort of heap on President Trump and the photographs of them together in the Oval Office almost showed a sort of subservience, not necessarily strength. And I think that that's an interesting element to be thinking about.
It's a very interesting element. The reality is that these European leaders have realized since Trump came back into office, and since he is more unbridled than he was in his first term because he has different advisors, talking to him, they've realized they are still so dependent on the United States in terms of their own security and certainly in terms of facing Russia. Now, we know that all these major European countries have woken up to that. They're trying to beef up their defense spending. Obviously, Germany is a prime example here, and to be able to be more self-sufficient in their own defense and also for their own security in projecting their ability to, say, guarantee Ukraine security, but they're not there yet. So in that sense, it's an acknowledgement still. I don't know if I use the word weakness. It's an acknowledgement of their continuing dependence on the United States and also of the ability of the Trump administration to make life much more difficult for them and to make it much more difficult to try and resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict in such a way that the Russians don't win.
Angela, in your comments before, you were talking a little bit of, in your opening remarks, you talked about European leaders leaving Washington on Monday and sort of feeling as if the U.S. had bought into security guarantees. Developments over the last couple of days have made it clear that Russia would not accept certain elements. And I think, one of our viewers actually poses a question that I had in my mind as well, which is that Moscow does not seem to be accepting any of the conditions that seem to emerge from the discussions on Friday and then on Monday. And as you said, the goal of having a ceasefire doesn't really seem to be in anybody's vocabulary except perhaps Friedrich Merz's. And so the viewer sort of brings his question or their question to the point by saying, was Monday a turning point or just a waste of time? And I would add sort of a photo op almost, since Putin now seems to be continuing to wage Russia's war in Ukraine, and there hasn't really been much that's changed.
So it certainly isn't a turning point. I would hope it wasn't a waste of time, because the issue of security guarantees hasn't gone away. But the problem is, unless the Russians are willing to negotiate seriously, all of these discussions are totally preliminary. I mean, another example of this is apparently Stephen Witkoff, the negotiator for Trump, who met with Putin a few days before the summit, came back and said that Russia would accept Article 5 guarantees for Ukraine. And President Trump reiterated that. Article 5 type guarantees, right? Which is that's collective defense. It's the NATO clause that said if one member is attacked, the others have a duty to at least talk about whether they will support that country that's been attacked. And a number of us were scratching our heads saying, what's an Article 5 type guarantee if Ukraine isn't in NATO? Because it would still commit then whichever countries were part of the security guarantees to actually contemplate going to war with Russia, a major nuclear power. And so I think part of the problem is there's been, lost in translation and misunderstanding. Of course, the Russians won't accept Article 5 guarantees. And again, Lavrov made that clear. So I hope it was not a waste of time, but I don't think that meeting on Monday has moved the needle any closer to getting serious negotiations. There's also no sign that President Putin's willing to meet with President Zelensky. They toy with the idea and say, well, of course, maybe one day we will when the circumstances are right. But they go back to the same mantra: the root causes have to be addressed. And the root causes are that they don't want Ukraine to be an independent sovereign country, making its own choices, for instance, to join the European Union were that possible. So they're completely, prevaricating on this now. And so I'm sure that the European leaders that went to Washington, I'm sure they had skepticism before they went. I mean, they understand what they're dealing with. But maybe they didn't think that it would all seem to fall apart so quickly.
Related directly to that, one of our viewers is curious whether you think Zelensky shouldn't actually actively be avoiding a meeting with Vladimir Putin right now, and how likely that sort of a bilateral meeting even is under current circumstances.
I don't think that Zelensky's avoiding it. He was before, and there was some legislation passed saying that he couldn't meet with Putin. But he's now, because President Trump has said that this is a precondition to resolving, to some kind of, or to entering into meaningful negotiations. He has said that he would meet with President Putin. Of course, President Putin, in a way, trolled him a couple of days ago, but by saying, "Oh, come to Moscow to meet here." Well, obviously, he's not going to go to Moscow to meet with President Putin. And then, there were other ideas floated: Budapest and, I don't know, Qatar or something, or UAE, whatever. But I don't think in principle we won't meet with him, because I think he's going to have to if the US says that this is a precondition for moving forward. But I think from Zelensky's point of view, it's Putin who doesn't want to meet with him. Putin believes that Zelensky isn't his equal. He says that Zelensky isn't a legitimate president because presidential elections were not held when they should have been, because the country's under martial law. It's at war. It would have been very difficult to do that. So I think, the Putin's the main obstacle to any kind of bilateral meeting. And the only other one they had was, I believe, in 2019. It was in Paris when they were still talking about the Minsk agreements and the annexation of Crimea, and that didn't go very well.
Yeah. Let's maybe come back to sort of the European context in just a moment, but I'd like to maybe back up a little bit and actually talk about Friday's meeting in Alaska, because we haven't spoken specifically about that. Obviously, given the book that you've written, you're a Putin watcher. I'd be very interested in your sort of sense of what Putin got out of the meeting. I mean, obviously, meeting with the president of the United States maybe made him less of a pariah than he had been since the start of the war. But what did Putin get? What did Trump give up? And one of our viewers asks whether the threat of secondary sanctions might have been part of the catalyst or motivation for bringing Putin to the meeting in the first place.
So I would agree with that person. I think the reason why Putin agreed to this at that time was President Trump had been expressing increasing irritation with President Putin. Yeah. He said, "We have all these great phone calls and then they keep bombing." And there was this threat of secondary sanctions, although they were then, of course, lifted as the summit approached. But they were at least theoretically placed on India, which is one of the two major purchasers of Russian oil, not on China, interestingly enough. I think Putin was concerned about that. And I think he was concerned that maybe Trump would take other actions, which, of course, could have involved supplying Ukraine with more weapons. I mean, right now, the Europeans are buying them from the US and sending them to Ukraine. So I think he may have been somewhat concerned that President Trump would be angry enough that he might take these actions. But I think it was also a great win for Putin, in as much as he has been indicted, as a war criminal. There are not that many countries he could have met President Trump in. Meeting in Alaska, in the United States, in a state that once belonged, to the Russian Empire, he just had to fly over Russia. He didn't have to worry about flying over any European countries. I mean, that, and then having the red carpet, having the warm handshake from President Trump, the applause, all of that, I think, was a great win for him. And if you look, if you look at what the Russian media are saying about that, they say, kind of, we won. So that in itself, I think, was a win for him. And then I think the fact that President Trump came out of the meeting saying, no ceasefire, we're going to go right to negotiations. And saying that, Vladimir Putin wants to end this war as much as I do. Subsequently, this wasn't in Alaska. We had a hot mic incident actually when the Europeans were there, where he said, well, I think that he's doing this to do me a favor. So, clearly that for Putin, again, Trump walked back. He said, we're not going to have any more sanctions. I mean, Putin's main goal is to prolong all of this so that Russia can still keep attacking Ukraine and gain more ground and possibly win. Now, having said that, I note that the meeting was truncated. It was supposed to go for 6 hours. It lasted for 3.5 hours. Putin brought a business delegation with him over there, and Kirill Dmitriev, who's the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, hoping to do business. I mean, we had Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick was in Alaska and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And Trump had talked about these big deals that the Russians and Americans can do. Drilling in Alaska, oil fields in Alaska. This is one of President Trump's pet projects. And yet there was absolutely no announcement of any of that, which just raises questions why. So they end the meeting early. They don't have lunch. And we now know from documents that were inadvertently left there, which the press got, you could see the menu for lunch. There was going to be a lunch. And then they had this very truncated press conference, I think 9 minutes. Putin just stood up and he spoke first, which was also unusual since he was the guest and you would have expected President Trump to speak first. And Putin praised the US, talked about the World War II alliance against Nazi Germany. He said at that point that, he agrees with President Trump that had President Trump been president in February of 2022, Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine, which I would strongly disagree with. But anyway, that's what he said. In other words, he flattered President Trump, and that was it. And then President Trump spoke for even less time, and thanked President Putin, and really didn't say very much. He said, there's peace will break out, and that was it. So you have to assume that there were some things that did not go as well in the meeting as one wanted. And then that was it. So I think that I'm not sure really that the US got anything out of that meeting. Maybe Trump's base was appeased by the fact that because they like Putin, many of the MAGA people, that he met with President Putin, that there's going to be Trump's the great peacemaker. As we know, President Trump would like to win the Nobel Peace Prize. When Zelensky was in his office, he said, I've solved 6 major conflicts in the last 8 months, including Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think that was the last one, who signed a peace agreement in the White House and not the Kremlin, which is interesting. So I'm not really sure what the US got out of that, but certainly, in the aftermath of that, and then you had the meeting with the Europeans, and then you have Putin essentially completely going back on what maybe President Trump thought that he had promised. So, and as some of my colleagues have pointed out, not only did they meet on the red carpet, they had this flyover with, advanced US weaponry. That costs a lot of money to get those planes from where they're based in the United States to do this in Alaska. It really was a very fulsome welcome for someone whom the rest of the West has really tried to treat as a pariah since the invasion.
Yeah, and I guess that relates to sort of what are the tools that the West has in its toolbox to try to get Russia and specifically Putin to respond. And there have been several questions about the use of sanctions and whether further sanctions by the West could put additional pressure on Putin at this point, or whether military support for Ukraine is really the only thing that could convince Putin to negotiate.
Well, that obviously is the key question. I'm just going to start off by saying what the Trump administration has tried to do in the last 8 months is to use economic incentives, thinking that that's going to change Putin's mind. And I will just quote a famous German phrase, Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. The idea that if you offer Russia economic incentives, that will affect its policies, and you have a lot of historical evidence that that doesn't work. So really, the only way that Putin will negotiate seriously is if he believes that Russia cannot win the war, which he doesn't believe at the moment. Sanctions, yes, you could have more sanctions, certainly tougher secondary sanctions on China and India, and by the way, Turkey, which is the third largest purchaser of Russian
Right.
oil. In other words, reduce the amount of revenue Russia can get. But so far, we really haven't seen that happen. Extra tariffs on Russia that were threatened. I mean, U.S.-Russian trade is minimal, so tariffs would really be meaningless.
Mhm.
Sanctions have had an effect on the Russian economy, less than I think the West had hoped from the beginning, but the growth rates have shrunk. Russia is entering a recession. Inflation is very high. Next year, the economic situation in Russia is going to be worse. But still, Russia has a wartime economy at the moment, and it's churning out weapons. Its factories are busy. It doesn't have enough people. It has underemployment there in Russia. I think the other side of this, and in my mind, the more important and effective one would be to supply Ukraine with all the weapons it needs to keep pushing Russia back. And unfortunately, the Trump administration hasn't done that. There was still some drawdown from the Biden administration in terms of weapons for Ukraine. I think there has been some small addition to that. The US Senate, with, I believe, the support of 89 senators, which means most of the Republicans too, has a bill there that would include much tougher sanctions and also more weapons for Ukraine. But they haven't done anything about it because the Republican majority is waiting for President Trump to give them the go-ahead.
Yeah.
But really, the only thing that would help is give Ukraine the air defense it needs, give it the weapons it needs to push back. Germany is, I think, supplying 2 Patriot batteries to Ukraine. That's great, but they need a lot more than that.
I mean, it sounds from some messages that are coming in that Trump posted on Truth Social that he's maybe more open to providing some of those weapons to Ukraine now. And this comes back to just sort of the uncertainty of Trump's position from day to day and how this is, just a constantly evolving story. And the question is, at what point will Ukraine get the kind of support that it needs to actually go beyond just defending itself, but go on the offensive in this conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think no one knows the answer to that. And unless there's a real change in US policy, it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to get the amount and of high-tech weapons it needs
Yeah.
to be. I mean, Trump said to Zelensky at one point, stop being on the defensive, go on the offensive, and then ask, can your weapons hit into Russia? It's fine, do that. And I think there's been some lifting of restrictions on how far Ukraine can fire into Russia using US weapons. But I don't think that we're near there yet. And just again, yesterday, President Trump also posted on Truth Social that it was up to Zelensky to end the war. He said that Ukraine started the war and it could end if Zelensky were willing, to sign a peace agreement, which would cede territory to Russia. I mean, President Trump talks about land swaps. It's not a land swap. It's Ukraine ceding territory in the Donbas area, strategic territory, which Russia doesn't control, Ukraine controls it. So
Right.
I think we have a lot of contradictory statements here, and
Yeah.
I'm not confident that Ukraine will get the weapons it needs, even though we know that if the US sends these weapons to Ukraine, you're employing Americans. I mean, a lot of the money that's been spent supporting Ukraine is spent in the United States, in US factories, giving work to Americans.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why this, this talk about deals with the Europeans is appealing, that they would, purchase U.S. military equipment, which they would then give to Ukraine. And this would obviously create, help support jobs, help support the economy in the U.S. Um,
But one other thing is, European countries certainly, but even the US, we don't have a huge amount of these weapons to supply right now.
Right.
And some of the contracts that the Europeans are signing with the US, it's going to take a couple of years. I mean, these companies can speed up their production of the weaponry, but it's not all readily available.
One of the things that we haven't talked about today is how the West and particularly the US might actually use frozen Russian assets to apply additional pressure on Moscow. Is that something that you have thoughts on?
Yes, I mean we have $300 billion, right, of frozen Russian assets, most of them in Europe, and so far the EU has agreed to use the interest from these frozen assets. But there's a big argument. I mean, there are certainly people in the United States, in Germany, and other European countries pushing to do this, saying this we should use these resources to support Ukraine. But there are other countries, I think France, at least until recently, was one of them, and others who question the precedent that this would set, and that if you use these Russian assets, who's to know in the future, what other precedents this would set. So I unfortunately don't see any agreement on that yet, and I think the question would be, what would it take for Europe? It's largely Europe because most of these assets aren't in the US, to agree to do that. And then we come back to the question, how bad would it have to be to induce people to use those frozen assets?
So, Angela, I want to pivot a little bit because you and Dan Hamilton just published a piece in Foreign Affairs this week that looks at the Black Sea strategy that the Kremlin has in its effort to basically project power and influence throughout the region more broadly, right? Into the Middle East, into the Mediterranean, and of course into the Caucasus as well. And I mean, I think it's no secret to people who are looking at what's going on that we're seeing great power competition unfolding as Moscow flexes its muscles. But can you talk a little bit about what you and Dan wrote in your piece about how this is maybe part of a larger campaign that's being led by the Kremlin to exert power and influence?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Russia, or the Russian Empire, has been seeking to dominate the Black Sea for centuries. I mean, that's why Catherine the Great in the 18th century, went to war with the Ottoman Empire, took Crimea and other lands in that part. And I think you have to understand, the war against Ukraine is, of course, about Ukraine. It's also about, the war with the West, which is the way that Putin terms it. But it is part of a broader Black Sea strategy for Russia to recoup its influence that it lost certainly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, dominate the Black Sea, influencing flows of people, flows of energy, of food, and then use the Black Sea to project power, as you say, onto the Middle East, to the South Caucasus and other areas. And the major obstacle to this really is Turkey, because Turkey controls through the Montreux Convention the access to the Black Sea. Turkey has now banned other ships from entering the Black Sea during this war. The Turkish-Russian relationship is complicated, but Turkey has also, of course, been a broker and a mediator at various points in the Russia-Ukraine war. And so what Russia is doing is, I mean, it has weaponized food. And in our article, we also quote some African leaders who've said that what Russia has been doing since it's been at war with Ukraine and weaponizing food, making it much more difficult to export the food, also for clearly the Ukrainians as well, for whom grain exports are a very important part of their economy. The flows of refugees and migrants that have been caused by this and other wars. So there's that aspect. And then the other aspect is the attempt really to dominate the other Black Sea littoral states. And we actually include Moldova in our article because it has a waterway that, borders Ukraine and Romania, and its waters flow into the Black Sea. And so what you see there is a campaign, both in countries that are now members of NATO, Bulgaria and Romania, a campaign by Russia to influence the politics then. And we saw in Romania, of course, you had an election that had to be rerun because of Russian interference. In Bulgaria, there's also been electoral interference. So those two countries are NATO members. Romania obviously is it has a major base for NATO, a very important NATO member as well, trying to influence the politics there to turn the population against their governments. And then even in a more concerted way, the use of hard power in Georgia, where, of course, you had the 2008 Russia-Georgia war. And it's very interesting. You now have in Georgia a government that's much more pro-Russian, that has passed legislation very similar to what they have in Russia, even though there's a lot of popular anger and uprising against that. And one of the reasons why the Georgian Dream Party, now prevailing in Georgia, won the last election was that a lot of the population looked at what happened to Ukraine and they said, we don't want this to happen to us. And if the only way to prevent another Russian invasion, again, Russia went to war with Georgia in 2008, and you have South Ossetia and Abkhazia that are frozen conflicts, is to vote into office a more pro-Russian government. And so Georgia is now really turned. And so Russian influence there, I think, has been more effective. Moldova is another state that we're really watching, much weaker militarily, a great Russian influence there. And you have parliamentary elections coming soon. So, and we look at all the different ways that Russia tries to influence politics there, including using the Russian Orthodox Church and appealing, populist messages, anti-woke, telling people that the elites in those countries, as they call them, are too pro-Western. So we look at that aspect of it, and then we look at the power projection. But interestingly enough, when you look at what's happened in the South Caucasus, Russia hasn't done that well there. I mentioned before that Armenia and Azerbaijan signed their framework agreement in the White House, not the Kremlin. Russia didn't come to Armenia's help in this last war when it lost Nagorno-Karabakh. Azeri-Russian relations have really deteriorated for reasons we don't have time to go into. But its influence in it may have gained something in Georgia that in Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think it's much more questionable. And then if you look at Russian power projection from the Black Sea to the Middle East, Russia has really lost influence in Syria. With the fall of the Assad regime, the Russians are still trying to maintain their bases there, their air and their sea bases. It's not clear what arrangements they will make. And then even with the other, with the Iran situation and the Russian-Iranian relationship is still important because Iran has been supplying a lot of drones to Russia, but still the intervention of the US and then the whole situation clearly between Israel and Gaza has complicated things for Russia. So I think what we show is, it's a mixed result, but the Russian impetus to try and exert more dominance in the Black Sea is still there. And so in the end, we talk about the necessity for the US and for Europe to develop a more concerted strategy. The EU does have a new strategy on paper. It doesn't really have the funding for it. NATO needs to do more. Again, all these places and the US, they're now developing Black Sea strategies, maybe a little late, but they have to, they have to act in as concerted a way as they can to prevent Russia from achieving its goals there.
And this is happening, of course, at the same time as some Europeans are expressing concern that Russia might target a EU member state or a NATO member state after the war in Ukraine is over or after it dies down. One of our viewers asks whether it wouldn't actually be in Europe's interest maybe to prolong the war in Ukraine because it would ultimately draw down Russian resources, weaken Russia, and give the Europeans more time to prepare their own defenses in case they were attacked by Russia.
Yeah, it's very difficult for me to agree that the Europeans should try and prolong the war in Ukraine because I'm just thinking about the human cost for the Ukrainians and the fact that Ukraine is still, fighting back. They do have a mobilization problem. They do need more weapons. And if you prolong it, Ukraine might be in a more disadvantageous situation at the end. And if that means that Russia gains more when the war ends, that's also, I don't think, that's also not a very good prospect for Europe.
Well, and this sort of comes back to, what is the role of the European leaders, right, who were in Washington on Monday? And you spoke about this earlier, that Friedrich Merz, the relatively new German chancellor, did try to bring the ceasefire back onto the table. But several of our viewers are curious specifically about what it is that Germany can actually offer when it comes to thinking about security guarantees. What sort of peacekeeping forces might they be able to provide? Because it seems as if boots on the ground would be incredibly unpopular in the German public. And so there are a lot of questions as to whether the Germans would actually join the British and French. Up to now, Friedrich Merz has been trying to shore up the relationship between Berlin and its neighbors in France and Poland, but also in the UK. How distracting could it be if Germany was not sort of part of that coalition of the willing, if you will?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is, and Merz has clearly started this, it's to, expend more on defense, to beef up the German military, to be in a situation where it can offer more. As you say, I mean, German public opinion is not strongly behind sending, boots on the ground soldiers to Ukraine to help keep the peace. And so I think, I mean, at the moment, it's much more likely that, and we're talking about who knows when the war will end. So this is not something that's going to happen immediately. But were there a peace agreement and were there some security forces there, it's much more likely that it'll be the British, it'll be the French, and some other countries. By the way, probably not the Poles at the moment either, who would provide the boots on the ground. So I think, in a sense, Germany has a little catching up to do in terms of its ability, but also the willingness of the population to support this kind of action. You do, of course, have a German military brigade, finally in Lithuania after a long time. So there are areas where Germany has been willing to provide that, obviously, through NATO. But I think at the moment, and, Germany, to the extent that it can, should also be able to provide not only, purchasing weapons from the US for Ukraine, but also more, as much financial support as it can with the European Union. But it's not the lead player in this at the moment.
Mm-hmm. No, obviously, Germany's not the lead player, but I think it does have an important role to play. But this is also a sign of how the Europeans need to work together in order to provide that counterweight, and not just as individual nation states. But it makes the path forward very, very difficult, right? Vladimir Putin continues to reject the notion of a ceasefire. He does not seem to be willing to meet Zelensky on neutral ground. We've talked a little bit about some of the security guarantees that have been floated, but none of them seem to be acceptable to Moscow. And so the question really is, what is the path forward if Russia can continue to fight and continue to reject any of these proposals that are coming from the Western countries?
So, I mean, I think the path forward, if Russia rejects all of these things, is for Europe, and hopefully the United States too, to increase its support for the Ukrainians, to keep them in this war as long as is necessary, for Putin to agree that there have to be negotiations and that Russia isn't going to prevail. He does not believe that yet. And I think, the very talk of, which you've heard from the US, not from the Europeans, but the very talk of, quote unquote, land swaps or making territorial concessions, I think will also keep him going, believing that he can achieve that as well, and hoping that if this war goes on much longer, the support for the war in Ukraine is still pretty strong, although it's eroding a bit. President Zelensky has had his own domestic political problems in the last month or two, which have to do with anti-corruption agencies. So I think the Russians are still waiting for this. I don't think there's anything, and unless there was also, and again, it would have to come from the US as well as Europe, the threat of really crippling sanctions. But and the use of these frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine.
Well, exactly. And as you said, I think the hardware, right, the true military support that has not been as forthcoming to Ukraine as many people have hoped. But in terms of diplomacy, sort of taking a step back and bringing our conversation back to the meetings that Trump had in Alaska with Putin on Friday and with Zelensky in Washington on Monday. Do you think that this sort of is an indication of sort of a strategy on Trump's part to play the mediator, as he's talked about, and bring this war to an end? Or does it do a better job of just sort of reflecting inherent contradictions in Trump's foreign policy right now? Because it doesn't seem to be, or there doesn't seem to be sort of a constant messaging that we can all take away from these various meetings, even your description of how things have changed since Monday in terms of the perception.
Yeah, so I think, this is the way that President Trump and his administration operate. There's no consistency. He will say one thing on one day, praising Putin, criticizing Zelensky, then praising Zelensky, criticizing Putin, then going back again. And this is against a background of the kind of denuding of our diplomatic service, right?
Yeah.
Our State Department is shrinking. There's been just another attack on, intelligence professionals who are very important. The former CIA director and Deputy Secretary of State and Ambassador to Russia, etc., William Burns, has an interesting piece today where he's really talking about how bad this is for the United States. And he's talking about being present at the destruction instead of present at the creation, Dean Acheson's book. So I think that's part of it too. I don't think there's a process going on. We don't know what the process would be. I think there are still behind the scenes conversations between different people in the Trump administration, and I think including on the business side, but we don't know very much about them. But I think inconsistency is a hallmark of this American administration. And since there's no clarity about a process to push this forward, I think the Europeans have to operate on their own, as they're doing, and trying to do as much as they can to support Ukraine and to persuade the American administration that it is important to do that, and maybe even to have a ceasefire, although at the moment that seems to be off the table. But there's a limit to what they can do as well because of the difficulty of dealing with this administration.
I mean, this sort of raises another question that you can also share some insights from your time in government service. I think that there was a lot of surprise at how quickly, particularly the Trump-Putin meeting came about, and of course the meeting on Monday. Usually these kinds of summits come at the end of many, many meetings between lower level diplomats who are trying to negotiate a deal. And someone actually just submitted a question asking whether this focus on summit diplomacy isn't a little problematic or even distracting, and goes on to ask whether the US and thereby the West are almost weakening their diplomatic position by trying to have these meetings involving the heads of state from the United States, from Russia, from Ukraine, and by making concessions in order to make these meetings happen, which means that at the lower level, some of the necessary negotiations are not necessarily taking place. And it's almost as if we're giving up too much.
Yeah, well, so in normal times, you would have a diplomatic process. You'd have American diplomats meeting regularly with their European counterparts, obviously, and having, even though we're in a war, having contacts with the Russians at all. I mean, during the Biden administration, there were very, very few contacts because of the war. But I think now, if you're really talking about trying to negotiate an end to the war, you would have had, as you say, great preparations for this meeting between Trump and Putin. You would probably have had some kind of communique agreed upon beforehand. You would have had a diplomatic process. But this seems to be absent. President Trump operates on this level of heads of state, and that's what Putin likes too. But the thing is, Putin has with him, and had with him in Alaska, two very seasoned diplomats, Yuri Ushakov, his foreign policy advisor, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. These gentlemen have been dealing with the West and dealing with this for decades. They have a lot of experience. And on the US side, you had people like Mr. Witkoff, who's a real estate businessman, who had no diplomatic experience. You had Secretary of State who's changed his position a lot. But this is what President Trump likes to do. He likes to deal with this, and he wants to dispense with normal diplomatic procedures. And again, that you see that reflected in what's happening in the State Department, and then also with the Defense Department and in the intelligence community. But I agree. I think you can only get a real negotiation going if you have diplomats, at different levels regularly meeting with each other, and you have a process that is comprehensible to those involved in it.
Angela, we started this conversation talking a little bit about the optics of the meeting in Washington on Monday, and I'd almost like to close by talking about the optics of Sergei Lavrov's arrival in Alaska, when he appeared to be wearing a sweatshirt with CCCP, right, the reference to the former Soviet Union on his sweatshirt. That has to have been intentional. What did you make of it?
Well, of course it's intentional. It's kind of trolling everyone. Back in the USSR, to quote the Beatles. In other words, that Russia, people like Lavrov, his generation, that includes Putin, they really don't accept the collapse of the Soviet Union. They feel it humiliated Russia, and their main goal is to restore Russia as a great power, and that's why they were happy to come to Alaska and have all the optics there. But of course, that's deliberate. The sweatshirt saying USSR, he didn't, pack it by mistake. And the message there is, we were a great country, we were the Soviet Union, and we're going to recoup a lot of that influence. So I'm sure that's why he wore it.
Angela, maybe as a closing question, obviously this is an unfolding story. There is a lot to watch in the days and weeks ahead, and it indeed seems to be changing on almost a daily level. But what would you recommend people to pay attention to and watch over the next couple of days?
So I think people should pay attention to what is coming out of the White House, and probably also, maybe the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, who's also the National Security Advisor. Is there any consistency in what they're saying, or, are they now saying President Trump's going to kind of walk away from this, wash his hands of it? It's up to the Ukrainians and Russians to do this themselves, in which case I would say Europe would have a greater role to play, but that would also mean there would probably have to be more contacts between European leaders and President Putin. So I think they definitely have to watch for that, and then just watch what Russia's doing. Last night, Russia bombed a major U.S. electronics factory in the west of Ukraine. So much for the idea that President Trump put forward. Well, if we sign a minerals deal with Ukraine, there'll be Americans working, they won't bomb us. So what? And the Russians have again increased their bombing of civilian targets of major Ukrainian cities. So watch what the Russians are doing, and if they don't stop what they're doing or diminish the number of attacks, I think you can also deduce your own conclusions from that.
Well, Angela, many, many thanks for joining us today. I've certainly learned a lot in the course of our conversation, and I hope that everybody who tuned in has as well. It's always great to hear your insights, and I certainly look forward to continuing the exchange with you in the weeks and months to come. So many, many thanks.
Thank you too, Steve, and to your audience. Bye.